Okay, we're back. Um,
All right, well, we're still live on Facebook, but
I can,
Emily, you can do that, or Emily needs to.
I'm live streaming.
Already done. Sorry, just was
Oh,
two
okay.
seconds slower than you. Yep.
Okay. Um,
So I have when I hear those statistics about how much Mormons are disliked or how few are liked,
Or
I,
known.
I guess I don't read the statistics deeply, so my just sort of anecdotal recognition or thought is that it's about missionary work. It's about the two elders at the door, and that's the world's experience with the Mormon Church, and that's what's disliked, which frankly is what I grew up with. I mean, the answer to the how do we reach out to the whole world that I grew up with from my church experience was through missionary work. I mean that our job is to convert the world and to bring all of them into the covenant, and that's not at all what you just preached, Dale.
So, look, my own sense, and some of this is just numbers, right? It's just a numbers game. And I actually ran the numbers. I was trying to find it. I ran the numbers at some point a year or so ago, just like theoretically. Like, if you think about every person who's ever lived on the earth, right? Um, Plus everyone who lives now. And then you add into that, and then you compare that with everyone who is a member of the church or who has been since the time of the Restoration. Like it's literally like one of those little plastics, beach buckets, like throwing it into the Pacific Ocean. You know what I mean? It's
yep.
it's like such a tiny, or I think about, you see those pictures of the solar system sometime or the universe sometime, and there's like that arrow that points a little tiny dot of light and says you are here. That's the church, right? You know what I mean? So look, if if it's true that God's mission is to bring to pass the, immortality and eternal life of all humankind, if that's true, and if it's true that we only get one mortal life, right? All of us only get one experience in mortality. Um, what that has to mean is that every kind of life, whether you're in the covenant or not, is an exalting life, right? It has to mean that because, because fundamentally we believe that the Heavenly Father is going to be just to his children and that everybody who comes to earth has a chance to become part of the eternal family of God, right? So every life is exalting, right? So what that means then, if you kind of just follow the logic through, is that all of those people, whether they're part of the covenant in life or not, and the vast majority are not, have been given gifts and talents and experiences and missions from God and all of these kinds of things. Like all of those things must be true. The other piece that we don't know, but that's hinted at in the scriptures, we don't know that God only made the covenant with Abraham, right? We don't know that. You know what I mean? Like there's no exclusivity clause as far as what I'm reading. Um, so what does that mean? Like God surely was inspiring others. Did he make similar covenants? We don't know. You know what I
Well,
mean?
can I make a comment? I mean, we
Yeah.
do know that, in fact, Hagar, when she was cast out, she was promised
Yeah. That
that
Ishmael
Yeah.
would,
Ishmael's posterity would also
yeah,
multiply.
would be a great nation.
We
Right.
don't have the details of that covenant because they weren't the people writing the story, but
Right.
it could have been
Yeah.
similar or maybe equal even to Abraham's.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to, as I'm saying all this, I don't want to discount the importance of the church. Like, and that's I think the other part of that tension, right? The church as an institution with with priesthood, we know that the idea that the power of God is seen in those ordinances. With an organizational structure to do certain things, with all of those things are super important, right? They're essential. But I think if we're only looking at that, I worry that we're kind of missing a lot, potentially like just a huge amount. And if we're always thinking, oh, the covenant and the covenant people are going to always be the leader on everything, that I just like that seems impossible to me. I don't see how you care for the poor and the needy, for example, if it's just us. Just doesn't work. Mathematically, it doesn't work.
Two things. You just gave a little like 2-minute sermon there that I would, Emily, we should try to capture that. See if we we can use that as a trailer or something. That was beautiful. Thank you, Dale. But not but that's the wrong way to connect. When you talk about this little point of light or this little arrow, you are here, and it occurred to me that we really need to do some thinking about how the gospel has provided, or how the church, the restoration has provided us some kind of seed, some kind of way that is other than bringing, through missionary work, bringing everybody inside, and other than, notwithstanding the amount of money that the church seems to have these days on a worldwide scale, it's still just a point of light. It's not,
Yeah, it's
I mean,
tiny.
we need to be about using it in good ways, but it's still just a point of light. How do we be a seed? How do we be a crystal, a what would you call it? An agent an effective agent of change, of peace, of reconciliation, I'm not even sure we have an objective function there, an idea of what we want to be about.
Yeah.
So Chris, I'll jump in with a couple of comments if you don't mind. And Dale, by the way, just thanks so much. This is just resonates so much with where I've been the last few months, and I'll share a couple of stories along those lines, and I'll get back to Chris's question a little bit as well. So we've been here in Minneapolis and dealing with the Zoramite problem of refugees not being welcome and
Yeah.
reaching out to neighbors and how does that feel? And so, we've had the experience of gathering at 5 below weather on a Saturday evening with 200 other people holding candles and singing songs together of support and love for our neighbor. And it had a profound effect on me the next time I was in Sacrament, because your framing of, I realize that I've carried for my many decades. I hear with fellow believers, and we are united in partaking in these covenants with Christ. And it's this little people in this room, and maybe some other people in other chapels. But having had my heart touched and uplifted and dedicated to service of my community, again, I started weeping, thinking about I'm involved in a covenant to bless everyone, and I'm just part of it. It's not like they're somehow missing something. It's like our hearts are united in caring for our neighbor, and there's no greater feeling of community and connection. So that was kind of this
Yeah.
humbling experience
Yeah.
on
Right.
my, and so then to go to Chris's comment. So my wife Cindy ended up actually being interviewed by some people at the Tribune, and they asked her, well, should the church be making a statement? And she said, much to her own surprise, she realized in the framing of the question, why should I wait for some authority to tell me what to do? Don't I already know what I need to do? Or don't I have enough discernment?
Yeah.
And the other person that was being interviewed was like, wow, I hadn't really thought of it that way either. Like, go and do good stuff. Why are you waiting? And I think that's part of the answer, because I loved what you mentioned about, revelation is scattered throughout the world. And my own experience is I have I've been deeply blessed by being involved with some very committed, called traditional, no, I don't know if it's even traditional, but Protestant and Catholic people focused on how can I lead a spirit-led life,
Hmm.
and seeing them act in ways beyond the normal and I think there's this sense, particularly even among younger people, the old institutional answers are not sufficient. So it is a great question. And the last thing I'll mention on this is that if if we think about God as saying his greatest gift to us was to exercise agency, and how, in a sense, constraining that is to him. As God, he says, I choose to limit myself to allow other people. And in fact, my wife and I and my son think there's nothing more important than they get to do that. So we're putting everything else on hold. And so as I've come across recently a program called the Freedom Fast, which is advocating on the 4th of every month, do a fast between now and the July 4th to honor the 250th anniversary of the country. And in that, someone was talking about how do you form a more perfect union?
Mm.
And I've really started to believe, oh, by perfect, it means how do I expand my capacity to live with people who are very different than myself? As
Yeah.
opposed to saying, I want a country where all agree on the very same thing. That wasn't the
Right.
point of the foundation. It was to say we trust that somehow John Adams and Jefferson, who hate each other and say all kinds of vile things about each other, will somehow become lifelong friends.
Hmm.
It's the miracle, the promise of it.
I think Melissa, in a way, like she writes about this a ton, and I love she writes about the idea of going to church and listening to somebody who you fundamentally disagree with for 10 minutes as an act of Christian service. And I love that as a concept, right? And she points out that if you ask, hey, such and such is sick, can somebody take a meal over? People jump right on that. But if you instead say, hey, I want you to sit down and listen to the most rabid MAGA Republican or the most rabidly left-wing activist Democrat for 10 minutes and don't fight with them. Just listen and try to understand why this is important to them. That's equally an act of service and something that we've, you know, like I had never thought about it that way, and I love that idea. I see there's a question here in the chat about the church's charity work. My answer to this would be both and actually. The church is doing an incredible amount of humanitarian work, about $1.4 billion last year. And that was up slightly from the year before. It was like $1.35 billion the year before. That puts the church in the top, 4 or 5 in the world in terms of religious organizations and that are doing humanitarian work. Now, the church does not split out how much of that money is being spent internally versus externally in a public kind of way, but I can tell you that just from dealing with it, you can say 50-50 more or less is not far off, and there may be somebody on the call who is more familiar than I am with the numbers, but a substantial portion of that is going to humanitarian services that goes out to people from all over the world, regardless and it's not tied in any way to missionary work. It's not tied to any of those kinds of things. One of the best things in the year and a half that I worked for the church was here in New York City. I would end up going to all these events with like the head of UNICEF USA or you know what I mean, major philanthropic organizations. I would end up sitting next to these people, and for 20 minutes, they would go on about the incredible work that they're able to do because of the generosity of members of the church. Like, it was completely eye-opening to me to see that. And right now, with USAID and cuts to foreign assistance, not just in the US, but worldwide, since the church has continued at the same level or gone up, that money has become even more important. So the reason I say it's both and is because, look, I personally think the church needs to be more transparent about its finances. Like, I think that could be done in ways that both protect the institution and give us more transparency. but also, we can do more. You know what I mean? Like we can do more. I know $1.4 billion sounds like a lot of money. It's not. Unfortunately, it's a tiny drop in the bucket. It can, compared with the foreign assistance budgets that were cut in the last 18 months. So that's why I think it's a yes and that's why I think we need to continue to push for church members to understand better what the church is doing. Some of that's just awareness. The church has gotten much more open about it. 5 years ago, the church hardly talked about what it was doing on the humanitarian side. And now there's a report that's filed every year. You can go on the website and read it. There's a lot of information. Most church members we're just not aware of it. I wasn't aware, and I consider myself to be pretty well read on these things. So, um, but Dave, I wanted to say thank you. You know, yes, those kinds of experiences are just like horizon expanding because they get at this idea, they help chip away a little bit at the idea that we and the people around us know the answers. And then instead they kind of push us toward this idea that, hey, sometimes we're just worker bees, and that's okay. And we don't need to wait. Like we don't, everything that we participate in terms of community service doesn't have to be organized by the church. We don't have to wait for it to be an elders quorum service thing or a religious society or a young women's project, right? And in fact, there's some limitations on when that happens because when you do it that way, you go as a group, you participate, the people you interact with tend to be part of the group, and then you go back to the fortress church. You know what I mean? And when you do it as an individual or as a family, I think you maybe form connections to the people you're working with who are not part of your group better. So anyway.
It was amazing to see here in 3 days showed up at basically a warehouse that had become the equivalent of the church's food distribution center. They had organized donations. There were food orders that we were fulfilling for 50 to 60 families that had specific needs and see that continuing still. I mean, it's like, okay, this is the Minneapolis Relief Society, program in action, just grow spontaneously. I mean, that kind of power to connect to people that we,
Yeah.
Take a lot of pride in. Like, look at how we do this, and it is second nature. And I don't mean to diminish what we're doing at all, but
Yeah. Well, and imagine if we took that like organizational capacity that like, your Deacons Quorum president has developed just because that's what we do in church and like applied that out to, you know, other organizations and like, you know what I mean? Like it's there, like we can
well,
connect in a lot of ways.
and I see leadership messages, highlighting you can't wait for the church to tell you. You have to have your own light of Christ. And I think that too often that's heard as well. That means just make sure I go to the temple and do all my covenant practices. Is very different
Well,
than saying I might learn how to go act and bless the community.
yeah. So I think the other thing that's happening is that like institutionally, we're in this interesting point for the church, right? And comes from me working for the State Department, an international organization that's 100 and, 200 years old or whatever, 150 years old, right? So there's all these connective tissues that are just like baked into the institution about how things work and how you get things done and how you like all that kind of stuff. So the church is still figuring that out. Like the church is still figuring out it still feels organizationally like a Salt Lake City organization with international branches, right?
Mm.
What it is moving towards, and I'm not telling you something that the church leaders don't know. Like I heard this over and over. Like what it's moving toward is an international organization with a headquarters in Salt Lake City. And that is a totally different thing. Like, and the church is trying to do that. Like just on the humanitarian side, used to be all decisions about humanitarian assistance were made in Salt Lake City, right? But a couple of years ago, they said, look, we got to get these decisions pushed out to the areas. And so now, again, I don't know what the exact percentages are, but they're pushing a significant percentage of that money out to the areas. and so that the areas are making those decisions. Same thing with communications. Up until 5 years ago, all communications decisions about what was going to go on websites all over the world were made in Salt Lake City, right? So you'd get these Christmas messages that were being shown in Indonesia of, a white couple standing in front of a Christmas tree in the mountains of Utah. Like has no resonance at all, right? And so instead they've started asking areas to produce Christmas and Easter messages that rely on the area traditions, around those holidays. So they're pushing all of that out. So like the church is aware of the issue, but like we as individual members, we basically have to do the same thing. Like how do we go from being members of a Utah church to being members of an international body of Christ that sees people from all over the world as equal partners in a work to raise and lift God's people? I mean, that's what we have to become. You know, it's going to take some time to get there. You know what I mean? But that's where we need to go, I think.
I'm reminded,
I love that.
I'm gonna flip the script for just a second here. I'm
Yeah.
reminded of back to the individual, I guess. I'm reminded of visiting with an aunt of mine who at that point had been probably not stepped foot in a church meeting for 20 years. And we got to talking about a family we knew that was in need. And halfway, what felt like halfway through the conversation, she stopped herself and said, "Wait a minute, I was a Relief Society president once. I know what to do."
Yeah. Yeah, right. She knows what to do. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, one of Cindy's friends, when we first were just dealing with the kind of horror sounds too strong, but the chaos that descended in January, and she said, Cindy,
I don't think horror sounds too strong, just for the record. Right.
you're probably yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's a horror, and just like what is going on? And Cindy's friend said, Cindy, we've been preparing for this our whole lives. We know how to make
Right.
deals. We know how to serve. Let's jump in
We know how
and
to do this.
let's get engaged. So
Yeah, and I think the other piece here that like at the congregational level is like, can we figure out how to switch from being meetings that are mostly centered on the boundary maintenance space and more centered on the mission to bless the whole world? So when you're centered on the boundary maintenance space, it can be very hard for people who are not what we might expect a church member to look like and act like to want to participate. When you're centered on the sort of help the world kind of space, reach out space, then can we create congregations that feel that way? Where no matter where you are in your relationship with God, you feel like the church is a place for you in your local congregation. Like that's like a pipe dream, I know. But
Yeah, I love it. There was a comment on the Facebook live stream about the recent emphasis on covenant path, and that has often encompassed this kind of boundary maintenance part of the covenant idea. But I think, this conversation really suggests that the covenant path, and if we're doing that external, outward facing, bless the whole earth, like can again like be more inclusive of those
yeah,
who are within the church, but also just uh yeah, kind of
well, in fact,
better
Abraham,
realize the kind of main point of the covenant.
yeah,
yeah, it's not about my salvation. Abraham is blessed with that covenant because he starts off by saying, I wanted to learn how to bless the whole world. And God says,
right.
okay, I'll
Yeah,
work with you then. I'll
yeah,
work with you.
okay,
Let's
let's
go
do
on a
it.
journey together.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Right.
So that if
Yeah.
we're saying if that's the path on my if what comes to mind on my covenant path is very different than I'm holding to an iron rod that's chaos and dark and threatening and lots of vile people, that's such a different framing of it.
It is. I mean, that is also a true framing at times, right? Like at times it does feel like that. But if that's all we're doing, then I think we miss like the whole point of like go back and like you read the Sermon on the Mount with this framing. Like and it just is I don't know. I read it and I think, oh my gosh, like if I took this seriously, like it is as revolutionary now as it must have sounded when Jesus Christ gave it. Like if we did that, like you know what I mean? It's like mind-blowingly big. Um, you know, I don't know how
I
we get
hope
there.
my heart was drawn to the part of the Abraham covenant where God says, I want you to leave the land of your fathers and take you to a new land. So I'm at the age where I'm like, well, I could just stay in my current land. I don't
Yeah.
need to work anymore. I could do interesting things. And that's very different than saying, oh, you're going to be in a wholly different environment with unknown changes and issues that are going to come up. Are you willing to live that kind of faith step
Yeah.
that is in front of us? And so if as a church we're saying, are we willing to become different than we have been? And I see lots of, promising shoots there, and I see, the traditional security of the other ones that, come up as well.
There's a tendency. I really love having you, Dale, with your background and foreign service. I think that's a rich way to come at this question because I feel a tendency to say, um, solving these problems, building a Zion society, recreating the city of Enoch, however you want to talk about it. Those big world problems, they're just too big. And the way to do that is to pull together into a small insular group that are all of one or common mind, and let's do it that way. And so the challenge that you present actually by your very presence, I mean by the work you've done in your life, is that those big world problems, famine, hunger, uh, etc. I could go on.
Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
the things we should be working with. I mean, they may be too big, but they're not. But still, that's
But again, it's a both and, right? Like it's, I remember, I can't remember which member of the Relief Society General Presidency it was who gave a talk where she talked about like, I think with a daughter, like loading up a truckload, like getting a truckload of donations and driving them to another country and like doing all this huge, and then coming home and realizing, wait, oh, that was awesome. That was really cool. Oh my gosh, look at all the things that my neighborhood needs. Like, you know what I mean? So it's like a both and thing. And that is the challenge, you know what I mean? But it is, look, if we're looking at how do we help all of God's children, sort of, if we recognize that all of the lives that they're living are the lives that are theirs toward, their step toward exaltation, and we are focused on how do we help provide conditions that are the best that can possibly be for their experience in mortality. It is a different frame, but it's the frame that is set out in Moses 139. Like it is that frame. And it's also the frame that's set out when you go on the church's website and look at the mission of the church. That's also the frame. Like it is that frame. But it is also Dave, your point is like you don't have to go to a physically different land. Like you can just go to a different neighborhood or maybe even your own neighborhood in Minneapolis and like it's right there. It's a different land only because you've never actually walked in it in that way.
Well, and I think the framing, the other thing that's impressed me is both Moses and Benjamin, King Benjamin, strike me as the most successful, competent people around. I mean, they're highly capable.
Yeah.
And they both say, I am nothing. And
Yeah.
I've said, what if that
Yeah.
isn't false humility? What if
Yeah.
it's just a recognition that,
Yeah.
yeah, I can do a few things. And I think as LDS people, we get caught up in the trap of, well, there's all these things I have to do 50 of them because
Right.
and we burn out and not realizing God's asking me to do two things.
Right.
And often those are the things I find the hardest to understand because
Yeah.
they require a complete kind of giving, all-in kind of feeling. So,
But as a political scientist, as like an institutionalist, and as like I think, and as a diplomat, I think the King Benjamin speech is like literally tells us the recipe. He literally says, if you do these things, then you'll have no disposition to do evil. You'll have no, like he tells us how to achieve, just to sound like a Miss America pageant here, but he gives the recipe for world peace, right? He tells you right there in Mosiah 2, 3, and 4, what what needs to happen. You know what I mean? Like he had the vision, and he's talking to a group of what, maybe 20,000 people. I don't know. But it's there, you know what I mean? The challenge for us is like, how do you both make it practical in like your day-to-day life, and then how do we institutionally and in the way we interact with other individuals and institutions make it actionable? And that's the challenge. Like that is a big challenge. I recognize that for sure.
Well, Dale, I'm looking at the time. I want to be
Yeah, I actually have to
respectful
go get on a train here in a little
of
bit,
your
so
time.
I haven't packed yet.
So I just wanted to just thank you again. And also, like, I think it was super helpful for me for you to, at one point in the lesson, point out that kind of this framework that we get at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, where there's a strict division, this boundary maintenance happening between, Nephi and like the Lamanites, and we tend, I mean, I think we take that too often as the model for kind of the covenant path, rather than like where the Book of Mormon ends up. And Moroni's message is like, get rid of
Yeah,
all of this strict division and this breaking up into
yeah,
ites, and look at what this does to the people and to the earth.
yeah,
And that this is not what the covenant path is about.
yeah. You
Yeah.
could view Nephi as almost like a tragic figure in that way. It's
Yeah.
like he sets out these like rules and divisions to like try to avoid what he saw in the vision, and then like ushers in the very thing
It's
that he's trying to avoid.
spectacularly, does not work.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, and, maybe Nephi didn't intend for it to be hardened in the way that, well,
Yeah.
we don't know, we can't tell, right? But certainly the seeds of what he writes as he's looking back develop into that. So anyway, well, look, this was fantastic for me. My wife's laughing at me because I haven't packed yet and I have a train in like less than 2 minutes.
Sorry, Michelle.
Yeah. But also, I'm very passionate about this, and part of the reason I'm passionate about it is that I've actually been trying to write something for the last couple of years,
Oh,
that
fantastic.
captures this. It's been somewhat elusive, but I do have a lot of written material.
Oh, that's great.
It's
Well,
like
maybe this has
pieces of
pushed you like to
chunks.
get that
So
out, because
yeah.
this is
So
just
anyway, I
fantastic.
need to like come back to it again and see if I can find a way to, I don't know, find a way to get it put together and published. And but yeah, anyway.
I would,
So
I think that reframing, what would be reframing for a Mormon audience anyway, the covenant path, that word by itself would be an important message. That's what I'm hearing from you today. And if you're writing something,
Well, fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, make it happen.
all
All
right.
right. Thanks, Dale.
Yeah,
Hey,
thanks
Thanks,
everybody. This
Michelle.
was great. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. We'll
Okay.
see y'all later.
Bye.